I'm Gracie Glasscock Walker. Until about 2 years ago in 1953, my husband Jesse Walker and I would sit out on the porch in our house up in town Bluff in the evenings. Our house sat right on the bluff. You go out the back door and walk a little ways and come to a fence, and you stop and you look down, and hundreds of feet below you was the Nature's River. Town Bluff was one of the first communities settled here in Tyler County, and was actually the county seat before Woodville was ever even a town. Our house sat there on that bluff over 85 years. And there was a room in the front, a small room in the front of the house there, and it was the post office for Town Bluff. This house had belonged to Jesse's father before him, Robert Walker. Then, in 1954, the government took that bit of land for the dam, to build the dam. And they moved our house directly across the road to the 130 acres that my husband had farmed with a mule and a plow. When they moved it, they put this siding on it. Just doesn't look the same anymore. Sort of glad Jesse's not here to see it. When we would sit out in the evening, we'd be looking at the highway that ran in front of the house. It's that highway that runs down there to Beaumont, where our youngest daughter, Weta, lives. We'd sometimes laugh that those people passing look at us and say, oh, those two old people, they don't know anything but memories of dirt farming. Well, we had plenty of those memories, to be sure. But we had memories of another kind, you see. We had lived another life once. And when we came back to settle here in Tyler County, well, Jesse, he said, Gracie, we can't talk about it. When our kids came along, he told them, you can't talk about it. You see, he said, I grew up in Tyler County, and this will be too strange to them. They may not trust us, so we don't talk about it. He drilled it into us so hard that when my kids were grown and gone, they still didn't talk about it. You see, it had to do with my family. The first time that Jesse and I saw each other, it was a spring day in 1898. I was sitting on a fine saddle on top of a sleek black show horse, leading 25 brightly painted wagons of a wagon show. There were 50 poodles and terriers and trained dogs. They were yapping away, and in one of the cages there were 2 lions there, prowling around. And my brother Alex's elephants were walking behind us. We were waiting to cross the ferry there. Now, ferries were very important places to us. You see, there was always going to be some time to cross the wagon show across that water, and there'd be people around. So during the time we spent there, we could put on a little bit of a show, see if we could get people interested in coming. Alex would take the elephants down to the water. They'd get their water, and then they'd spray themselves, and they'd spray each other, and they'd put on a real show. And then I would take my parasol, and I would get up on the wire that guided the ferry across the river, and I would wire walk that across the river and back. You see, this wagon show was owned by my father, John Benjamin Glasscock. He had come down with his widowed mother from Missouri, and they settled in Franklin Parish, Louisiana. couple of things happened there. He delivered goods from the riverboats to the surrounding plantations. Well, ship captains who brought their ships into New Orleans, if they were coming from faraway lands, they sometimes brought exotic animals in and they would sell them on the side for a profit. So, one day my father came by a monkey off of one of the riverboats. Now, he trained it to do tricks. Now, the other thing he did was he fell in love with Elizabeth Rebecca Armstrong, the daughter of a wealthy plantation owner. Her father and her brothers did not take kindly to this. So one day, John Benjamin and Lizzie, as she was called, and the monkey eloped. But when they ran out of money in Texas, John says to Lizzie, people will pay to see this monkey perform. And that's how it all got started. You see, my father was a businessman. He had good business sense. Actually, all the circuses that started in the United States were just a matter of operating a business. He went from 15 wagons to over 45. And as the children grew up, 7 of us actually we performed in the show. One of us sold tickets. We were not really a circus family, you see. But it seemed that every one of us that performed had a really good sense of balance. And we were agile, and we were good with animals. And then since it was me and 5 boys, we were probably all daredevils. We kept egging each other on to do better and better tricks. There's a funny story about my getting started in the show. You see, eventually I became La Gracie. That's how I was billed. And I did bareback riding and contortion and trapeze and tight wire and slack wire, and I made costumes. But the story is that when I was 3, we were camped outside town there, and Daddy took me in with him when he went in to visit town. And he stopped to talk to some men, and he set me up on his shoulder. And he kept talking. I got bored, so I stood up. He became aware that I was standing up. So he put his arm out to the side, and I walked to the end of it, and I walked back. Stuck his other arm out, walked to the end of it, and walked back. He set me down. He said, young lady, if you can do that, you're in the show. I don't think they put me in the show quite that early, but I was still very young when I was important to the show another time. We were camped out again. It was after supper, and I was just dancing around, playing around the campfire, and robbers came into camp. So my daddy gave me the high sign. Now I danced over to him, and he slipped me the money bag. I just kept dancing around, playing around. Robbers didn't pay any attention to me. I saw a hole in the ground, so I pretended to trip, and then I stuffed the money bag in the hole. Robbers did not get our money that night. Well, back there at the ferry, many years later, I was a grown girl then, and Jesse Walker was sitting on a brown pony, and he was dressed in his East Texas Piney Woods clothes, but he was handsome. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and dark curly hair. It was a spring day, and the redbuds had been out, and the dogwoods were coming out. It was beautiful, but there was nothing more beautiful that day to Jessie than me. And there was nothing more eye-catching to me than Jessie. Well, finally, the wagon show got across the river and headed on into Jasper County. And Jessie and his friend turned to go back home. And then Jessie stopped. And he said, "That's my girl." I want you to know it was only 2 or 3 days later that he showed up in Kirbyville and hired on to the show. Jessie Walker ran off and joined the circus. Our kids would never believe it. But he was a good tuba player in the band, and he was a real cute clown. Oh, it wasn't long after that we were married. We traveled with the show for several years. Our first 2 children were born in a trunk. Then about 1904, Jessie's mother had died. Jessie's daddy was getting older. Our family was growing, and Jessie was the eldest son. So he decided that we needed to go back to East Texas and take over the homestead. So we gave up the hard life of the wagon show for the hard life of dirt farming. We never regretted it. We loved each other. We always loved each other. It was one of those stories, you know. We had 8 children. 6 of them are still alive. Now, my family went on with the show. After a while, Mom and Daddy decided that while the 4 youngest kids were still in school, they wanted to quit traveling. So a house was bought for them in Blanco, where the show wintered. They settled down there. And the show was turned over to my oldest brother, Alex. Now, Daddy was a businessman, but Alex is what you'd call a hustler. But he kept the show going. He had his ups and downs, but he built it up to 11 railroad cars, touring in the United States and Canada. He eventually sold it to Ringling Brothers. Now, the other boys, Foster and Donnelly and Mike, they were getting older by this time, and they were still performing with Alex, but they had their own families and their own troops and their own acts. So they got to looking around. Alex had his bad times, and you know they had growing families. So they looked around, and towns were springing up, and vaudeville stages were being built. And they got to thinking, we can take this typewire act and we can cut it down and put it on a vaudeville stage, and that's what they did. Each of them formed their own troupe, and they toured around. Oh, they toured on the best circuits. They did real well. They performed with Al Jolson and George M. Cohen, and Sophie Tucker and Will Rogers and Mae West. Sometimes they got to see each other because 2 of the troops would be booked into the same town at the same time in 2 different theaters. Now, one of the young boys, Gus, who was still back in Blanco, well, he ran off when he was 10 years old, and he joined up with Mike's troupe in Chicago, and later he performed with Donnelly's troupe. Donnelly's troupe was booked on a world tour once. You know, there wasn't a lot of competition. You could make some really good money in vaudeville, and those boys did. And they knew people who'd made money. So, when vaudeville began to play out at the start of World War I, they had a decision to make. Now, the oldest one, Foster, he wasn't a businessman. Sweetest guy in the world. Called him Buddy. But he had to stay in the show business all his life. That's all he could do, and he did it. But the others, Donnelly, Mike, Gus, and then Lonnie, who sold tickets, They cast their eyes on the oil fields of East Texas. They had their ups and downs, but those boys ended up real well. Typical Texas millionaires, oil, land, cattle. When movies came out, Donnelly built a string of movie houses in Central Texas. And Gus was one of the first guys to go put a catamaran drilling rig out in the Gulf of Mexico. Wherever the boys went, they would send me cards and letters. I'd tuck them away in my tin-top trunk, along with my costume and my parasol and all my equipment to make costumes and pictures. But there was one thing that wasn't in my trunk, and that was my slack wire. It was coiled up and hanging in the smokehouse. Well, one day, Jesse got it out of the smokehouse, and he put it up in the backyard where nobody else could see it. He took all the children outside, and I went out and I did a backflip on that wire. He wanted them to know, he just didn't want them to talk about it. We wondered sometimes if our kids would ever show any interest or inclination that way. They didn't. But you know, they say this skips a generation sometimes. So I've been looking at my grandkids, keeping an eye on them. The older ones, no. Now, Tim's got 3 daughters, Darlene and Christy and Kathy. And I hear Darlene's kind of interested in the acrobatics. But my youngest daughter, Weta Adkisson, down there in Beaumont, she's always brought her daughter Elizabeth Ann up here to visit me. And when she was younger, out in the yard, she'd do acrobatics and contortion. She was as agile as I was. So I'd bring her in the house, and I'd take a glass, and I'd put a little water in it, and I'd set it on her head. And then I said, walk that line in the linoleum and don't spill a drop. She'd do it. Oh, it made Weta so nervous. What was going to become of this child? Well, she's about grown now, but you never know. Elizabeth might just up and join the circus one day or go off the stage. We just never know. We'll just have to wait and see.